The Lorith research base had many sounds if one listened carefully enough. There was the distant humming of gravity stabilizers adjusting the station's slow orbit. There was the soft clicking of atmospheric processors correcting oxygen ratios with quiet, obsessive dedication. There was also the occasional frustrated sigh of human pilot Saren Vane, who at this moment was staring at a translation console like it had personally insulted his entire species. "Explain to me again," Saren said, rubbing his eyes, "why this machine thinks the word table could mean either furniture, political negotiation, or ceremonial sacrifice." Across the lab, Eve did not immediately answer. She was reviewing a wall of flowing symbols projected in midair, each one part of a linguistic matrix mapping human expressions to Illyrian conceptual structures. Finally, she spoke. Because human language is structurally chaotic. Saren leaned back in his chair. "That feels judgmental. It is observational." Saren gestured at the console. "This thing just suggested we sacrifice a coffee table to conclude a treaty." Eve tilted her head slightly. Her long ears shifted with emotion, catching the cool white light of the laboratory. "That would be inefficient diplomacy." "You think?" The translation system chirped again. Saren read the next line and groaned. "Oh great! Now it thinks the phrase break the ice means we should destroy a glacier before starting negotiations." Eve turned to face him fully now. She studied the screen, then him, then the screen again with the calm patience of someone who had spent the last 3 years trying to explain humans to an entire alien civilization. "Human metaphors remain one of the most statistically dangerous features of your species." Saren pointed a finger at her. "We invented jazz and pizza. That should buy us some tolerance. Those concepts remain under review." Saren laughed quietly and swiveled his chair toward the observation window that dominated one side of the laboratory. Outside, the massive gas giant Lorithroman 4 turned slowly beneath the station, its violet storms swirling across an endless atmosphere. Lightning flickered through the clouds like silent fireworks. Saren had seen the sight thousands of times. It still felt unreal. 3 years, he muttered. Eve glanced at him. "Clarify." "I've been here 3 years and the planet still looks like a giant cosmic smoothie." Eve considered the gas giant carefully. "That comparison is visually accurate." Saren grinned. "Thank you. Finally some respect for human poetic genius." She returned to her translation matrices. Saren watched her for a moment. Eve looked almost human at first glance. The structure of her face was familiar, her posture graceful and composed. But the differences were always there if one paid attention. Her ears were longer than any human's, elegant arcs that extended past her hair and angled slightly backward. They moved subtly when she listened, adjusting like delicate antennae reacting to sound. Saren had once asked if they were sensitive. Eve had replied with absolute seriousness. "Yes, please do not attempt to test that again." Saren had promised nothing. He spun slowly in his chair. "So what exactly are you doing now?" "Recalibrating semantic equivalence parameters." "That sounds complicated." "It is." Saren leaned forward. "Does it involve sacrificing any furniture?" "No." "Disappointing." The console beeped again. Eve glanced at the screen and then paused. Her ears shifted slightly. "That is unusual." Saren straightened. "Unusual bad or unusual interesting?" "The system has flagged a visual recognition anomaly." "That sounds expensive." Eve gestured to the main display. A holographic recording appeared between them, footage from a station corridor earlier that day. Several researchers walked through the frame. Then Saren entered the recording holding 2 mugs of coffee and trying not to spill them. "That's me," Saren said proudly. "Yes." The recording paused. The system highlighted Eve, who appeared a moment later entering the corridor from another door. Saren frowned. "Why is it analyzing you?" "The visual AI has detected repeated human gaze fixation." Saren blinked. "What?" Eve read from the screen. "During the past 92 days, You have looked at my face approximately 412 times longer than statistically required for conversation. Saren coughed. That sounds scientific. The system zoomed in on Eve's eyes. Saren leaned closer to the display before he could stop himself. Amber light reflected inside them, caught by the station's illumination and the purple glow from the planet outside. For a moment neither of them spoke. Saren scratched the back of his neck. "Well," he said slowly, "that's a little creepy. The system is merely analyzing patterns." Saren waved a hand. "Sure. But it makes me sound like a guy who stares at people." "You do stare at people. I observe. Your observation duration exceeds normal parameters." Saren pointed at the screen. "Maybe the system just appreciates good lighting." Eve studied him with calm precision. "You are avoiding the statistical conclusion." "What conclusion?" "That you find something visually notable." Saren opened his mouth to respond. Then he looked at her again. The soft glow from Lorithroman 4 reflected faintly in her eyes now, turning the amber into something almost golden. And before his brain had time to consult the diplomatic survival manual, Saren spoke. "Your eyes are beautiful, you know." The room stopped moving. The air recyclers hummed quietly. Somewhere in the station a maintenance drone clattered into a wall. Eve did not blink. Her ears lifted slowly. Saren felt the exact moment his brain finally caught up with his mouth. "Huh," he said softly. Eve stood up. She looked at him for several seconds with an expression Saren had never seen before, something between confusion, shock, and the mental equivalent of a computer trying to divide by zero. Then she turned. Without a single word she walked out of the room. The door slid shut behind her with a quiet mechanical click. Saren sat alone in the lab. He stared at the door, then at the console, then back at the door again. After a long silence he leaned back in his chair and muttered to the empty room. "Well," he said, "that seemed disproportionate." Saren Vane had once accidentally landed a cargo shuttle upside down on a lunar docking pad. It had been a complicated situation involving faulty thrusters, an angry customs officer, and a crate of experimental gravity boots that turned on at the worst possible moment. The incident report had been 32 pages long and contained the phrase, "Pilot exhibited creative interpretation of orientation," at least 6 times. Even that had felt less uncomfortable than the silence currently sitting in the translation lab. Saren stared at the door Eve had just walked through. He waited. Nothing happened. He checked the console. Still nothing happened. "Okay," he said quietly to the empty room. "Maybe she just needed air." The station's atmosphere system immediately hummed louder as if offended. "Not like that," Saren muttered. He leaned back in his chair and tried to reconstruct the previous 60 seconds of his life. Step 1. Observe alien colleague. Step 2. Notice eyes. Step 3. Say something nice. Step 4. Alien colleague exits like she just witnessed a supernova. Saren rubbed his face. "Right," he sighed. "That probably meant something." The translation console chimed helpfully. A message appeared across the screen. Cultural note. ILARIN communication prioritizes functional language. Saren pointed at the display. "Yes, thank you, machine." That information would have been extremely helpful about 2 minutes ago. The console responded with another cheerful beep, which Saren interpreted as smugness. He stood up and paced the lab slowly. Outside the massive observation window, Lorithroman 4 rolled silently through space, violet storms flashing across its atmosphere. The sight usually relaxed him. Right now it felt like the universe was quietly watching him embarrass himself. "All right," he said, thinking out loud. "Worst case scenario, I accidentally proposed marriage to a linguist." He considered that. "Actually no," he added. "Worst case scenario is that I insulted her ancestors, her planet, and possibly her breakfast." The door slid open. Saren straightened immediately. It was not Eve. A small maintenance drone rolled inside the room, its metal body wobbling slightly as it scanned the floor for dust particles that had absolutely no business existing on a research station. Saren pointed at it. You saw that, right? The drone beeped. I'm asking for a witness statement. The drone rotated its camera and continued cleaning. Traitor, Saren said. He walked out into the corridor. Lorith Research Base had long curved hallways designed to match the ring structure of the station. The walls glowed with soft white light, and occasionally transparent panels revealed the endless stars outside. Saren walked slowly, scanning for one very specific alien linguist. Instead, he encountered Professor Talrin, an Illyrin astrophysicist who looked permanently annoyed at the concept of gravity. Talrin stopped. Pilot Vane. Professor Talrin, you appear unsettled. Saren considered lying. Then he remembered Talrin once spent 40 minutes explaining orbital mechanics to a coffee machine. Honesty felt safer. I may have said something culturally questionable. Talrin's ears lifted slightly. Define questionable. Saren hesitated. Complimentary. Talrin blinked slowly. That is unusual for humans to consider dangerous. Well, apparently it is today. Talrin studied him carefully. What exactly did you say? Saren scratched his neck. I told Eve her eyes were beautiful. Talrin froze, not dramatically, just completely. For several seconds he did not move at all. Then he said very calmly, Ah. Saren did not like the way he said that. That's an ah with implications, Saren said. Talrin folded his hands behind his back. You may wish to consult the cultural archives. That bad? Talrin tilted his head. In Illyrin society, aesthetic commentary regarding sensory organs is considered. He paused, searching for a translation. Profoundly personal. Saren's stomach dropped slightly. Define personal. Talrin's ears twitched. The closest human equivalent would likely be romantic declaration. Saren stared at him. Romantic, yes. Saren pointed down the hallway where Eve had gone. I said it like someone commenting on a sunset. Talrin nodded. That may complicate interpretation. Saren leaned against the wall. Okay, hypothetically, if someone said that accidentally, humans frequently do many things accidentally, would the situation be fixable? Talrin considered this with the seriousness of someone calculating orbital trajectories. Possibly. Saren brightened slightly. How? Talrin answered immediately, by clarifying intention. That sounds reasonable. Talrin nodded again. Yes. However, there's a however. Yes. Saren closed his eyes briefly. Of course there is. Talrin continued. Clarification requires the other participant to return for discussion. Saren opened his eyes, and if she does. Talrin gave a very small shrug. Then the statement remains unresolved. Saren stared down the hallway again. That sounds like something linguists would consider terrifying. Talrin looked mildly confused. Unresolved meaning is deeply unsettling. Saren exhaled slowly. Fantastic. Talrin walked away. Saren remained there for a moment, thinking. Then he returned to the lab. The room looked exactly the same as before, console humming. Planet turning, chair slightly crooked from where he had stood up too fast. Saren sat down again and waited. 5 minutes passed. 10, 20. He began composing possible apology speeches. Sorry, I didn't realize complimenting your eyes was equivalent to emotional warfare. He winced. Too dramatic. Another attempt. I appreciate your ocular symmetry in a purely scientific manner. He winced harder. Worse. The door slid open. Saren turned instantly. Eve stepped inside. She walked slowly into the room and stopped several steps away from him. Her posture was perfectly straight. Her long ears were upright and very still. Saren noticed something unusual. She looked focused, like a scientist examining a rare and slightly dangerous specimen, which Saren realized might currently be him. She spoke. Pilot Vane. Her voice was calm, precise, controlled. Yes, Eve looked directly at him. Did you understand the meaning of the statement you made earlier? Saren blinked. Not even slightly. Silence filled the room again. Eve studied his face with intense concentration. Then she asked carefully, each word measured like laboratory data. When you said my eyes were beautiful, she paused. Did you know what you were saying? Saren Vane had flown through asteroid storms, negotiated landing rights with a species that communicated entirely through musical chords, and once spent 4 hours explaining sarcasm to a diplomatic AI that kept trying to apologize to itself. None of those experiences had prepared him for the quiet intensity currently directed at him from across the laboratory. Eve was still standing where she had stopped when she entered the room. Her posture was perfectly balanced, her long ears held upright in a way Saren had learned meant absolute concentration. "When you said my eyes were beautiful," she repeated calmly, "did you know what you were saying?" Saren did not answer immediately, mostly because his brain had suddenly decided to review every possible wrong answer first. Finally, he lifted his hand slightly in surrender. "No." Eve blinked once. "You did not." "Nope. You were unaware of the cultural implications. Completely unaware." Eve studied his face for several seconds as if trying to detect deception. Saren tried very hard to look like a man who had not accidentally triggered a cross-cultural emotional event. It was harder than expected. At last Eve spoke again. "In Illyrian society," she said slowly, "eyes are classified as sensory instruments." Saren nodded. "Right, tools, yes. Like cameras, biological cameras." Saren pointed at his own face. "Humans also have biological cameras, yes, but we still complement them." Eve tilted her head slightly. "That remains statistically strange." Saren leaned back in his chair. "Humans complement lots of things. Examples: hair, non-essential; smile, ambiguous signal; shoes." Eve paused. "Shoes. Don't question human fashion culture, it's chaos." Eve seemed to accept this explanation, though her ears shifted slightly as if they were personally skeptical. She continued, "In our culture, sensory organs are valued exclusively for their function." Saren nodded again. "Makes sense. To describe them as beautiful implies their existence serves a purpose beyond observation." Saren opened his mouth, then paused. "Oh." Eve watched him carefully. "Yes, that's not normal. It is considered extremely intimate." Saren leaned back farther in his chair until the rear legs lifted slightly off the floor. He stared at the ceiling. "Okay." Eve waited. Saren slowly lowered the chair again. "So let me clarify something," he said carefully. "You're telling me I accidentally said something romantic?" Eve hesitated, her ears tilted just slightly backward. "Yes." Saren nodded slowly. "Well." He rubbed his forehead. "That explains the dramatic exit." Eve did not react to that. Instead, she said something unexpected. "You are not permitted to retract the statement." Saren looked up. "I'm sorry, what?" "The statement has already been processed." "That sounds like you ran it through a supercomputer." "In a sense, I did." Saren gestured vaguely toward her head. "Brain processing." "Yes." Saren leaned forward on the desk. "Okay, but humans apologize all the time. Why? Because we say dumb things. That seems inefficient." "It is extremely inefficient." Eve considered this. Then she shook her head once. "The statement cannot be undone." Saren frowned. "Why not?" "Because intent has already been evaluated." "That sounds dangerously final." "It is merely logical." Saren sat quietly for a moment. Outside the observation window, the violet clouds of Lorithroman 4 shifted slowly as lightning flashed across the massive atmosphere. The station hummed softly around them. Finally Saren sighed. "All right." Eve waited. Saren looked at her again. He studied her face thoughtfully, like someone trying to solve a puzzle that had accidentally become personal. "Can I ask something?" "Yes." "Your people never say things are beautiful." Eve answered immediately. "Rarely." "Why?" "Beauty implies value without function." Saren nodded slowly. "Humans like that. That is unusual. We like art." "Art has no functional purpose." "Exactly." Eve seemed mildly troubled by this. Saren leaned back again. "Look, if it helps," he said, "I didn't mean to cause a cultural crisis." "You did." "Sorry." "You are not apologizing correctly." Saren raised an eyebrow. "There's a correct way to apologize." "Yes." Saren sighed. "Of course there is." Eve stepped slightly closer to the desk. Clarification is required. All right. She looked directly at him. When you said the statement, what did you mean? Saren opened his mouth, closed it, then he shrugged. I meant what I said. Eve blinked. You did not intend cultural meaning. No. Yet you maintain the statement. Yes. Eve's ears shifted slightly. Explain. Saren turned his chair toward the observation window and gestured toward the massive purple planet outside. When the light from Lorith reflects in the lab, he said casually, your eyes catch it. Eve did not move. Saren continued. They turn this weird gold color like amber glass. He shrugged again. I noticed it, so I said something. Eve was silent. Saren glanced back at her. What? You are describing aesthetic perception. Yeah, that perception serves no functional purpose. Correct. Eve stared at him with growing confusion. Saren gave a small smile. And I still mean it. For the second time that day, Eve became completely motionless. Her ears lifted slowly. Saren immediately noticed. Oh no, he said. Did I do it again? Saren Vane developed a new habit over the next few days. Whenever he walked into a room and saw Eve, he immediately asked himself a very important question. Is my mouth about to ruin my life again? So far the answer had been, possibly, on 3 separate occasions. The first time happened in the station cafeteria. Saren was holding a tray containing something that the food synthesizer insisted was lasagna, but which looked suspiciously like heated geology. Eve entered the room and paused when she saw him. For a moment they simply stood there. Then Saren raised a finger. Before we begin this conversation, he said cautiously, I would like to announce that I will not be complimenting any of your sensory organs today. Eve stared at him. That is a strange declaration. I'm trying to establish a safety protocol. That may be unnecessary. Saren relaxed slightly. Great. Then Eve added, however, I have been studying the statement you made. Saren sighed and sat down. Of course you have. Eve placed her tray across from him. I have reviewed human linguistic databases. That sounds dangerous. It has produced several questions. Saren poked his suspicious lasagna with a fork. Go ahead. Eve folded her hands together. Humans frequently describe objects as beautiful. Yes. Even when those objects have clear functional purpose. Yes. Example. Aircraft. Saren nodded proudly. Very beautiful. Aircraft are transportation devices. They're also shiny. Eve seemed mildly troubled by that logic. Saren took a bite of lasagna and immediately regretted it. Also, Eve continued, humans describe astronomical objects as beautiful. Correct. They are massive gravitational bodies. Still pretty. Eve leaned forward slightly. This implies humans frequently assign aesthetic value independent of function. Saren pointed his fork at her. You're starting to understand us. That behavior appears inefficient. Saren shrugged. Probably. Eve watched him carefully. Then why do it? Saren leaned back in his chair. Because it feels good. Eve blinked. Clarify. When humans notice something beautiful, Saren said, we like saying it out loud. That does not change the object. Nope. It does not improve its function. Nope. Then what is the purpose? Saren grinned. The purpose is the moment. Eve went very still again. Saren immediately noticed. Oh no, he said. Did I trigger another cultural event? Eve tilted her head. No, good. I am analyzing. That sounds worse. Eve looked down at her tray. Within Illyrian society, she said slowly, language is designed to communicate precise information. Right. Statements without informational value are considered unnecessary. Saren nodded. Humans specialize in unnecessary statements. That is becoming clear. Saren pointed at her. For example, Eve looked up. You have interesting ears. Saren froze. They both stared at each other. Saren slowly lowered his fork. I walked into that one. Eve's ears twitched slightly. That statement was observational. Saren raised both hands. I swear it was scientific. You previously declared you would not comment on sensory organs. I forgot ears counted. They are auditory receptors. Saren leaned back in his chair. Great, I've expanded the problem. Eve watched him with what looked suspiciously like amusement. Saren squinted. Wait, Eve blinked. What? Your ears just moved. They do that. No, differently. That is unlikely. Saren pointed dramatically. I saw it. Eve folded her hands again. That was normal motion. Saren leaned forward. You're amused. I am not. You totally are. I am evaluating human behavior. Saren smiled. Sure. Eve looked away briefly. Saren sat back, pleased with himself. Then the cafeteria door opened. Professor Talrin walked in. He saw them sitting together and immediately slowed down. His ears lifted slightly. Saren noticed. Oh no, Saren muttered. Talrin approached the table. Pilot Vane, linguist Eve. Professor, Talrin glanced between them. I understand a linguistic event has occurred. Saren dropped his head onto the table. Of course you do. Eve spoke calmly. The event has been partially clarified. Talrin nodded thoughtfully, and the statement remains valid. Saren lifted his head slowly. What? Eve answered before he could speak. Yes. Talrin looked mildly impressed. That is unusual. Saren pointed at both of them. I feel like I missed a meeting. Talrin turned to him. You maintained the aesthetic claim after learning its cultural meaning. Saren rubbed his temples. Yes. Talrin nodded again. That indicates sincerity. Saren stared at him. Does it? Yes. Saren looked at Eve, then back at Talrin, then back at Eve again. Well, that's great, Saren said, because I definitely meant it. The cafeteria went quiet for a moment. Eve's ears slowly lifted again. Saren noticed immediately. I did it again, did I? Eve did not answer. Talrin quietly took a step backward. Saren pointed at him. Don't leave me alone with the consequences. Talrin calmly walked away. Saren looked back at Eve. She was studying him with that same intense focus from the laboratory. Saren sighed. Okay, he said. Next time I think something nice, I'm just going to write it down and throw it into space. Eve considered that. That would be inefficient communication. Saren groaned. Everything is inefficient communication. Eve watched him for another moment. Then something subtle happened. Her ears lowered just slightly. Saren noticed. And for the first time since this entire situation began, he realized something strange. Eve wasn't confused. Not exactly. She was curious, which Saren suspected might be far more dangerous. Saren Vane discovered that curiosity was a far more exhausting problem than confusion. Confusion usually ended quickly. Someone asked a question, someone gave an answer, and everyone returned to pretending they understood the universe. Curiosity, on the other hand, never stopped. Eve had become curious. This meant Saren was now being studied like a rare and slightly unstable research sample. It began 3 days after the cafeteria incident. Saren was in the flight control bay attempting to convince a navigation computer that the phrase, "take the scenic route," was not a valid interstellar trajectory command. The computer disagreed. Pilot, the console said in its calm synthetic voice, the requested path would increase travel distance by 23%. Yes, this is inefficient. Yes, clarify purpose. Saren leaned back in the pilot chair. The purpose is vibes. Vibes are not measurable, not with that attitude. The console paused for 2 seconds. Attitude detected. Saren pointed at the screen. That was sarcasm. Processing. Before the computer could escalate the situation into another philosophical argument, the door opened. Eve entered the flight bay. Saren immediately sighed. Oh good, he said. The research department has arrived to observe the strange human. Eve ignored that. I have questions. Of course you do. She stepped closer to the console. You stated earlier that humans experience pleasure from observing aesthetic phenomena. Saren nodded. Yes, I would like to test this claim. Saren raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a trap. It is an experiment. That sounds like a scientific trap. Eve gestured toward the large viewport at the front of the flight bay. Outside, Lorathroman 4 rotated slowly beneath the station. The violet atmosphere churned with electric storms and bright spirals of glowing gas. Eve looked at the planet. Humans often describe astronomical formations as beautiful. Correct. Observe. Saren leaned forward. I have been observing that planet for 3 years. Then describe it. Saren looked at the massive world turning below them. Lightning flashed across the clouds like silent veins of light. He shrugged. It looks amazing. That is not precise. Purple storm marble. Still imprecise. Saren leaned back again. Okay, fine. It's huge, chaotic, dangerous, and somehow still pretty. Eve nodded slowly. That description contains contradictory elements. Humans are comfortable with contradictions. That appears to be true. Saren pointed toward the window. You see the lightning inside the clouds. Yes, that's the good part. Lightning is destructive. Exactly. Eve looked thoughtful. Saren noticed something. Her ears had tilted slightly forward. Wait, Saren said. Eve glanced at him. What? You're actually trying to see it. Clarify, you're trying to see what I see. Eve considered that. Yes. Saren grinned. Well, that's adorable. Eve's ears twitched. That word is unnecessary. It means you're doing something charming. That is not a functional classification. Saren waved a hand. Welcome to human vocabulary. The navigation computer spoke again. Pilot, the term adorable is defined as mute, Saren said quickly. The console fell silent. Eve studied Saren again. You continue using language with emotional value rather than informational value. Saren shrugged. That's how humans communicate. That is inefficient, yes, and yet you persist, constantly. Eve was quiet for a moment, then she said something unexpected. Your earlier statement remains unresolved in my analysis. Saren groaned. We're still on that. Yes. 3 days later, yes. Saren leaned forward on the console. What part is confusing? Eve answered immediately. You learned the cultural significance of your statement. Yes. You understood it implies deep personal meaning. Yes. And you did not retract it. Saren shrugged. Correct. Why? Saren blinked. That's the question. Yes. Saren thought about it. Then he shrugged again. Because it's still true. Eve stared at him. Saren gestured vaguely toward her face. Your eyes still look cool when the station lights hit them. Eve's ears lifted slightly. Saren immediately noticed. There it is again, he said. What? That ear movement. It is normal. No, it is. It is. Saren leaned closer. You're embarrassed. I am not. You absolutely are. I am processing data. Saren grinned. That's alien for embarrassed. Eve crossed her arms. That conclusion lacks evidence. Saren pointed dramatically. You just crossed your arms. That is a neutral posture. On Earth, that's defensive. This is not Earth. Saren leaned back, satisfied. Still counts. Eve looked away toward the window again. The purple storms of Lorathroman 4 rolled silently beneath them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eve said quietly, humans say important things accidentally. Saren laughed. All the time? That is alarming. It's kind of our brand. Eve turned back toward him, and yet you refuse to retract the statement. Saren shrugged. Because I meant it. Eve went completely still again. Saren sighed. I should really stop saying that, should I? Saren Vane had reached a scientific conclusion. Alien linguists were far more dangerous than asteroid fields. Asteroids moved in predictable ways. You could map them, dodge them, and if necessary shout creatively at the navigation computer until it cooperated. Linguists, however, asked questions. Questions that continued for days. Questions that turned casual comments into philosophical investigations. And most importantly, questions that involved a certain pair of amber eyes looking at him like he was an unsolved equation. Saren discovered this again while attempting to repair a stubborn cargo drone in Maintenance Bay 3. The drone was upside down. Saren was also almost upside down, half inside a service panel. Listen, Saren muttered, tightening a panel screw. I know you think gravity is optional, but the station disagrees. The drone beeped irritably. I'm fixing you, Saren added. Another beep. That was gratitude. The door behind him slid open. Saren did not need to look to know who it was. Eve had developed a habit of finding him, which Saren suspected was part of the ongoing human behavioral observation project. "You are speaking to the machine again," Eve said. Saren remained halfway inside the panel. "Yes. It does not understand you. It understands my tone. That is unlikely." Saren pulled himself out and sat on the floor beside the drone. "On Earth we yell at machines all the time. Does that improve their function? No. Then why do it?" Saren shrugged. "Emotional maintenance." Eve stepped closer and looked down at the drone. "It is inverted." "Yes. That is inefficient." "Tell that to the drone." The machine beeped again. Eve watched it carefully. "Did it respond?" "Yes." "What did it say?" "It said it regrets nothing." Eve tilted her head slightly. "That seems improbable." Saren grinned. "You'd be surprised." For a moment they both looked at the drone. Then Eve said something Saren had started expecting. "I have continued my analysis." Saren leaned his head back against the wall. "Of course you have. The statement you made regarding my eyes remains unresolved." Saren groaned quietly. "Eve, yes. It's been 5 days, yes. You're still analyzing a compliment. Yes." Saren pointed at her. "This is why humans invented poetry, so we wouldn't have to explain things." "What is poetry?" Saren stared at the ceiling. "Oh no. What?" "I'm not explaining poetry to a linguist." "Why not?" "Because you'll take it apart like a machine. That is the purpose of linguistic study." Saren sighed. "Exactly." Eve crouched down beside him so they were both sitting on the floor next to the confused drone. "You said the statement remains true," she said. "Yes." "You said the meaning did not change after learning its cultural implications." "Yes." Eve looked directly at him. "Why?" Saren looked back at her. For once he didn't answer immediately. Instead he shrugged. "Because noticing something nice and saying it out loud seems normal. That behavior creates misunderstanding." "True. And yet you continue doing it." Saren grinned slightly. "That's humanity." Eve watched him carefully. "You do not appear concerned about the cultural consequences." "Oh, I'm extremely concerned." "You do not behave that way." Saren pointed at the drone. "I hide my stress by repairing things." "That appears ineffective. It works emotionally." The drone suddenly beeped and flipped upright with a small mechanical jerk. Saren blinked. "Well," he said, "that was convenient." Eve looked at the machine. "It repaired itself." "Don't ruin my moment." The drone rolled away. Saren watched it go. Then he leaned his head back again. "You know what the weird part is?" Eve waited. "I've said way more embarrassing things in my life." "Yes. But somehow this one refuses to disappear." "That is because you maintain the claim." Saren nodded. "Fair." Eve was quiet for a moment. Then she asked something softer than usual. "When humans say something important accidentally, do they always stand by it?" Saren thought about that. "Not always." "Why not?" "Because sometimes we panic and pretend we didn't mean it. And you did not do that." "Nope." "Why?" Saren looked at her again. The maintenance lights reflected faintly in her eyes. He shrugged. "Because it would be a lie." Eve froze again. Her ears lifted slowly. Saren noticed immediately. "Oh, come on," he said. "Not again." Eve didn't respond. She just kept studying him with that intense analytical focus. Saren rubbed his face. "You know what's terrifying?" "What?" "You're starting to understand humans. That is my objective." Saren shook his head. "That's dangerous." "Why?" "Because once you understand us, you'll realize we don't understand ourselves." Eve considered that. "That is already apparent." Saren laughed. "Fair." For a moment they both sat quietly in the maintenance bay. Then Eve said something Saren did not expect. "You are unusual." Saren looked at her. "I'm human. That is part of the problem." Saren smiled slightly. "I'll take that as a compliment." Eve paused. Then she said carefully, "It was not intended as one." Saren pointed at her. "See, you're learning." Saren Vane did not intend to start a cultural incident. Unfortunately, by the end of the week, that was exactly what had happened. It began quietly, too quietly. Saren noticed the change during his morning walk through the research corridor. Several alien researchers stopped talking when he passed. One of them actually turned and stared at him like he had just violated an important law of physics. Saren slowed. "That can't be good," he muttered. A maintenance drone rolled past him. "Do you know what I did?" Saren asked it. The drone beeped once and kept moving. "Traitor." When Saren entered the observation deck, Professor Talrin was already there, standing near the panoramic window. The violet storms of Lorathroman 4 churned beneath the station. Talrin did not turn around. "You have created a linguistic anomaly." Saren sighed. "I was afraid of that." Talrin finally looked at him. "In Illyrin culture," Talrin said calmly, "a statement like yours is extremely rare." "I figured. It implies that the speaker values perception itself, not function, not classification, simply the act of seeing." Saren leaned on the railing. "Humans do that a lot." "Yes." Talrin folded his hands behind his back. "That is why it is unusual." Saren glanced around the observation deck. "So why is everyone staring at me?" Talrin answered immediately. "Because Eve has not corrected the statement." Saren blinked. "She's supposed to." "In our culture," Talrin said, "such a statement requires clarification, acceptance, or rejection." Saren rubbed his forehead. "And she hasn't done any of those things." "No." Saren groaned softly. "Oh no." Talrin nodded once. "She has instead been asking questions. That's her favorite hobby." Talrin looked mildly amused. "Yes." Saren stared out at the storms below the station. "So what does that mean?" Talrin considered the question. "It means she is deciding whether your statement has meaning." Saren chuckled nervously. "Well, that seems like a lot of pressure for 6 words." Talrin tilted his head. "Language often is." Saren stayed quiet for a moment. Then the door behind them opened. Saren did not need to turn to know who it was. Eve stepped onto the observation deck. Saren glanced at Talrin. Talrin immediately walked away. Saren pointed after him. "Coward." Eve approached slowly. Her long ears shifted slightly as she stopped beside Saren at the railing. For a moment neither of them spoke. The stormlit planet rolled silently below. Finally Eve said something. "I have reached a conclusion." Saren closed his eyes briefly. "Well, that sounds terrifying." Eve ignored the comment. "In Illyrin society," she said carefully, "our language exists to describe reality precisely." Saren nodded. "I've noticed. Statements are meant to transmit information." "Yes." "Your statement did not do that." Saren smiled slightly. "That's the human specialty." Eve looked at him. "For several days I believed your statement was an error. Reasonable. Then I believed it was a cultural misunderstanding. Also reasonable." Eve paused. "However, I have continued observing human behavior." Saren raised an eyebrow. "I apologize for humanity. That will not be necessary." Eve looked back toward the planet. "Humans say many things that have no direct function, constantly. Yet those statements influence behavior." Saren nodded. "Yep, you notice things that others overlook." "Sometimes. And when you speak those observations, they affect how people see themselves." Saren blinked. "Well, that sounds more impressive than it feels." Eve turned back to him. "Your statement had no functional purpose." "Correct. But it was not meaningless." Saren studied her face. "So what does that mean?" Eve hesitated. It was the first time Saren had ever seen her hesitate. Her ears shifted slightly again. Then she said quietly, "In my culture, eyes are tools." Saren nodded. "Yes, they gather information." "Right, they are not meant to be admired." Saren shrugged. "Humans admire everything." "Yes." Eve looked directly at him. "And yet when you said those words, you were not analyzing. No, you were not studying. No, you were simply seeing." Saren smiled faintly. "Yeah." Eve was quiet again. Then she said something Saren did not expect. I did not know how to respond. Saren laughed softly. "That makes 2 of us." Eve continued studying him. "However, I have reached a decision." Saren straightened slightly. "That sounds official." Eve nodded once. "In Illyrin communication, when a statement carries personal meaning, it must be acknowledged." Saren rubbed the back of his neck. "Okay." Eve's ears lifted slightly. Therefore I will respond. Saren waited. Eve spoke carefully. When you said my eyes were beautiful, I believed it was an error. Saren smiled. Fair. But after observing your behavior, I believe you meant it. Saren nodded. I did. Eve held his gaze. I still do not fully understand why humans say such things. That's okay. But I understand that you were sincere. Saren leaned on the railing again. That's about as accurate as it gets. Eve was quiet. Then she said something softer. When someone observes you in that way, it changes how you see yourself. Saren looked at her. Is that bad? Eve considered it. No. Saren smiled. Well, that's good. Eve's ears twitched again. Saren pointed immediately. There, that thing again. Eve looked annoyed. That movement is normal. No, it is. It is. Saren laughed. You're embarrassed. I am not. You definitely are. Eve folded her arms. That conclusion lacks evidence. Saren grinned. I've been studying alien behavior all week. Eve stared at him. Then unexpectedly she smiled. It was small, but it was real. Saren blinked. Oh wow, he said quietly. That's new. Eve looked away toward the storm-covered planet again. Human behavior is unusual. Saren nodded. That's a polite way to say chaotic. Yes, but I believe I understand something now. Saren waited. Eve said calmly, sometimes language is not meant to explain reality. Saren tilted his head. What is it for then? Eve glanced at him. Sometimes it is meant to show someone that they have been seen. Saren thought about that. Then he smiled. Yeah, he said, that sounds about right. They stood quietly together while the violet storms turned slowly beneath the station. After a moment, Saren spoke again.